welcome to UVic Legacy Galleries. It's wonderful to see most of your faces, some masked, some unmasked here this evening. We're just warming up to our in-person openings this week at Legacy, so it's a bit of a new phase for us. My name is Jillian Booth. I'm the curator of academic and community programs here at Legacy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are, with respect, the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territories the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. Thanks for coming this evening to celebrate the opening of Isshoni, Henry Shimizu's paintings of New Denver Internment. Now I want to know, was that any better of pronunciation of it than last night? Okay, good. We are marking several anniversaries with this exhibition, as it has been 20 years since Henry completed the last painting in the series, 10 years since they were shown at UVic to commemorate Dr. Shimizu receiving his honorary doctorate of laws at UVic, and indeed 80 years since Japanese Canadians were interned in BC in 1942. Henry's paintings evoke vivid memories of his time in the internment camp in New Denver, asking viewers to remember the past, bringing it to the present to remind us to never forget the wrongs that were done, and to inspire our continued fight against systemic racism today. Henry Shimizu has a long resume, with some highlights being his successful career as a plastic surgeon in Edmonton, serving as the president of the board of the Art Gallery of Alberta, as well as chairman of the Redress Committee of Japanese Internment. He received the Order of Canada in 2004. Henry, it's an honor to have you here this evening and to be hosting your exhibition. Before we move on to our main speakers this evening, I wanted to say a few words about how the exhibition came together. So a few years ago, John Price, Professor Emeritus in the History Department at UVic, urged Legacy to have a new exhibition of Henry's work and suggested that we hire an emerging Japanese curator to consider Henry's work in a contemporary light. Then John made the connection with Bryce Kanbara to act as a mentor to that curator. So this evening, we will hear from Samantha Marsh as the exhibition curator and Bryce Canvara with a Lansdowne Lecture entitled Japanese Canadians in the Art. Did you think it'd come true? It's been a real pleasure working with Samantha and with Bryce, and it's been a great learning experience over this past year. So I'll just introduce Samantha and then turn over the mic. So Samantha Marsh is a mixed-race Yonsei cultural worker and independent curator, currently based in Vancouver. Both within her personal and professional lives, Samantha is passionate about making art and culture engaging, relevant, and accessible for underrepresented communities. Since completing her MSc in Museum Studies from the University of Glasgow, Samantha has worked with the Pal Street Festival Society and the Japanese Canadian community to create intercultural and intergenerational programs, events, and initiatives. I will also say that Samantha is a wonderful person to work with. She has a big heart, and we just had her here yesterday speaking with our visitor engagement folks, talking about her process, talking about the history of internment, talking about the paintings in a very intimate way, and we learned so much from you, Samantha, so thank you very much for all of your work on the exhibition and for being here tonight.
Thank you, Jillian. And welcome, everyone. As Jillian introduced, my name is Sammy Marsh, and I'm the curator of this exhibition. I am Yonsei, which is a fourth-generation immigrant of mixed European and Japanese heritage. I'm a cultural worker and independent curator, and like many to this country, I'm a settler on these lands. I would like to take this time to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Esquimalt and Songhees, and the Wasanich people. The systems of oppression and racism that have and still displace and dispossess Indigenous people are ongoing. I strive to deepen my understanding of these lands and waters by listening and learning from and with Indigenous knowledge sharers. I am grateful for their generosity in doing so, and I acknowledge both Japan and Europe have had active roles in colonialism. The title of this exhibition, Isshoni, means together with. So let us come together to reflect on this land that we call home and the people who have cared for it since time immemorial. I hope in doing so, we can move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. This exhibition would not be possible without the support and involvement of so many special people. I would like to thank the Shimizu family, Joan, Henry, Greg, and Kimiko, for their generosity in sharing their family's story. I'd like to thank Bryce Kanbara, who's been an incredible mentor throughout this process, as well as John Price, who has been instrumental in initiating this exhibition. I would like to thank the Legacy Gallery staff, as well as the University of Victoria for their hard work for sharing this and for sharing this space with us today. I'd also like to thank at this time the Japanese curators for this, Japanese translators for this exhibition, Sophia Kitazume and Atsumi Nakao. My hope in making this exhibition bilingual is to engage the community of post-war Japanese immigrants living in BC. While many do not have direct ties to internment, they are important members of the Japanese Canadian community, and I think we need to make that a very welcoming space for us all. There are so many other special people who have supported me throughout this process, and I would like to thank my family, my friends, my mentors, and the Powell Street Festival Society for who have made me who I am today. As Jillian mentioned, this is an important memorial year for the Japanese Canadian community. It marks 80 years since the start of internment. On March 23, 1942, the Shimizu family were uprooted from their home in Prince Rupert and forced to leave behind their beloved New Dominion Cafe and Hotel. Henry was only 13 at the time. His family was allowed to bring 150 pounds of personal belongings per adult and only 75 per child. Their home, business, and belongings that were left behind were later sold by the government without consent to pay for their internment. 22,000 people of Japanese descent living within the 100-mile zone along the BC coastline were forcibly removed. Many ended up in internment sites in interior BC, as well as labor and prison camps east of the Rockies. The vast majority of those removed were Canadian citizens. The stated reason for removal was a concern for national security, yet no evidence has ever justified this position. In truth, internment was due to racist policies aimed at alienating, dispersing, and dispossessing Japanese Canadians of their property and communities. Even after the war had ended, Japanese Canadians were prevented from returning to their homes on the West Coast until 1949, 4 years after the war had ended. For these reasons, conversations around intergenerational knowledge sharing remain ever relevant. It is timely that we celebrate and discuss this series of paintings, as this year marks the 20th anniversary of their completion. Henry, as Jillian mentioned, has had a long and distinguished career as a plastic surgeon and advocate for the Japanese Canadian community. He began this series in 1999 as a way of sharing his bitter but also sweet memories of building lifelong friendships and community during his time in the New Denver internment camp. This exhibition takes a new approach to presenting these works, grouping them into themes which discuss long-lasting effects of internment while pairing them with quotes from 3 generations of the Shimizu family: Kimiko, Henry's mother, Henry, as well as Greg, Henry's son. The inspiration for this multi-generational perspective was a 1992 interview with Kimiko. Joan, Henry's wife, shared this with me, and I was deeply moved by Kimiko's personal reflections on the internment experience. From there, I knew this exhibition was going to put the faces and voices of Japanese Canadians at the forefront. It is easy to look back at injustices and question how they were allowed to occur. Yet we continue to see patterns of displacement and exclusion of people around the world based on ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, sexual orientation, accessibility, and more. I hope you hold this in mind as you walk through the exhibition. If you would like to support the preservation of this history for future generations, I encourage you to consider donating to the Nikkei Internment Memorial Center, located on the site of the former New Denver internment camp. Once again, I would like to sincerely thank the Shimizu family, Henry, Joan, and Greg, who are joining us with us tonight, for sharing this significant work as well as their personal stories. I know that visitors to this exhibition will appreciate their generosity and be inspired to explore their own family histories. At this time, I would also like to welcome Greg Shimizu up to the podium to share a few words about the family's involvement in this exhibition, as well as Prince Rupert, which there's a very interesting story in the exhibition about, which includes cherry blossom trees.
My mom says, huh? She doesn't know about this. I'm not going to use the mic.
Okay.
Because I move around a little bit when I talk. So, sorry, camera. Thanks, Sammy.
Thanks, Greg.
Sammy asked me today, did I bring the hyoshigi? So, this was something that was unplanned until she found out that it was going to happen today. So, I'll tell you a little bit of a story here. It's going to take a few minutes. She mentioned March 23rd. Do you remember that date? In history, 1942, when the Japanese were taken from Prince Rupert. So that's when my father and my grandfather went and left Prince Rupert. They were interned in New Denver for 4 years. After that, they settled in Edmonton. And after that, my grandfather, at some point, I'm going to tell you, it was in 1959, decided to do something. And he decided, and we don't know exactly why, but he decided to do, you're going to have to decide for yourself the meaning of this gesture. But he sent 500 cherry trees to Prince Rupert. Something that grandmother was not so pleased with. But he decided to do this. He went blind about 1953, 1954, and this occurred in 1959. So he was never going to see these cherry trees bloom. 500 trees were sent to Prince Rupert, to the city, and they were planted. He really enjoyed that gesture, and he repeated that in 1960 for 1,000 more. So 1,500 cherry trees were sent. And he did this while he was blind. He wrote letters. And it was a sort of a family story in my growing up that it was just sort of a myth. And I knew about this as a myth. I have a Taiko group. So Taiko is the art of Japanese Taiko. We called our duo, it's just a duo, my partner and I, called Booming Tree. It's a very few people in the Taiko world know we're called Booming Tree because of my family history about that. They just think we're called Booming Tree because it's a cool name. But because we play loud drums, Booming Tree, it's organic and it's fun, and anyway, they think, wow, it's a cool name. But they don't really know that we did it because my grandfather had these trees in Prince Rupert. The Archive Society has no records, or they didn't expose that as a historical fact by any means. Then I was researching this historical thing back in 2016, 2017, 2015. I thought I better look into it a little bit more, just for myself. I sent letters, emails. everywhere, and the last email was to the Archival Society, and they said, we don't know anything about this. There was no records kept, because this was some Japanese person sending trees to them in 1959 and 60. We didn't keep records. I was at my parents' house 2018. They said, oh, there's a bunch of pictures under the steps, Greg. You should go look at this box. It's been down there for 10 years, and I always found old pictures of Grandpa and Grandma. Very bottom of the box, we came across some letters from the school saying thank you for the cherry trees, from the mayor. I actually found documents. I found the bill of lading. I found actual documents about this, the real documents. I took pictures and I just put it away on my phone. Didn't think anything of it because it's only for me and my family. It's nothing for the world. It's not important. I don't need to share this with the world. It's just for my own personal history. I'm not documenting this for anybody else. It's just my own booming tree history of my family. I get a call March 23rd, 2018. Archives is calling me saying, CBC wants to talk to you. We're not going to give you their number, but you need to call them. Something's happened. I go to Facebook of Prince Rupert. He's got 400 messages on the mayor's page. They've chopped down the cherry trees that were in Prince Rupert. What cherry trees? That there weren't any. You guys couldn't tell me there was. No, there's cherry trees in the federal building right downtown. I've never been there, but apparently there were 7 cherry trees that were part of the fabric of that town that were chopped down, and it was an uproar by the citizens of that town. They didn't know anything of the historical fabric of those cherry trees by any means, but they were just there. And the citizens were outraged that their personal home had been chopped down by somebody. Long story. I'm not going to get into the long story of it. I just said, well, you guys are really upset. Their citizens were outraged that their home, these beautiful cherry trees that had been there, they just knew that they were there, had been chopped down. And I said, you know what, if you send me the wood, I'll do something with them. I'm a musician, I'll make a musical instrument. I'll connect with my Taiko friends across Canada and the world that I know, and maybe we can make some bachi or some hyoshigi out of the wood. And the federal government managed to get me the wood, and they sent me the wood. These are the first pair of hyoshigi that have been made now of the wood, so I'm going to play them for you guys today. So this is 60-year-old wood, 60-year-old tree that has been chopped down, unfortunately, of my grandfather's trees that he had sent in 1959 and 1960. We don't know really what was the meaning of this, the meaning of home, the meaning of togetherness. It was in her speech today, and I said I wanted to give a new life to those trees. The impermanence of life is what is the sound of sakura. So I just wanted to give you guys the pleasure of maybe the opening of the show tonight, and for Sammy's great show with a little song, not a song, maybe just more of a melody on hyoshigi. These are handcrafted, not by me, because look how beautiful they are. So I didn't do these. I've got a whole bunch of friends in Edmonton who made these for me. A group of carpenters turned them. So this is the first time these have been played. We actually made one pair of bachi, and actually the greatest taiko player of Japan happened to be coming to Calgary, and he happened to take and was honored to take the one pair of bachi that we were able to make from the one pair of bachi. The wood was so cracked that we were only able to make one pair of bachi, and then we've made 4 sets so far out of the wood. So this is the actual trees that were cut down in 2018. So, oh! Hey! Oh, fresh. Hey! Oh, good. Sa! Good. Sa!
Thank you so much, Greg. It's such an honor to be able to be some of the first people to have heard these played for the first time. So very grateful that this is the space that we've been able to share with you in that moment. Now I would like to turn things over to Bryce Kanbara, who has mentored me throughout this curatorial process. Bryce is an artist and curator who has created work with and about the Japanese Canadian community for over 50 years. In 2021, Bryce received the Governor General's Award for Outstanding Contributions in Visual and Media Arts. Over to you, Bryce.
Okay, I'm not here to entertain you, so hang on. Sammy, thank you for that, and thank you, John Price and Jillian Booth, the Legacy Gallery staff, and I guess the U of Vic Department of Humanities for making it possible for me to come to Victoria. I'm really glad to be here with you. I just wanted to alert you that there will be a few projected slides up here, and I apologize to the artists for their quality because I just shot them quickly with my phone from books, but they're mostly meant to provide a visual background, so you have something to look at besides me, and I assure you this is not going to be a slide talk. Okay, so let's go. Japanese Canadian art. Did you think it had come true? Did you think it had come true? It doesn't roll off the tongue. I know it sounds a bit clunky, but they're words inspired by the last line of a short poem written by Sansei poet David Fujino around 5 decades ago now. David's poem is eloquent and evocative. It goes like this. Japan, Japan, if I say it enough, do you think it'll come true? The contraction it'll, in it'll come true, which David chose to use here, lends a casual tone to a serious question. Its effect for me is comforting in its informality and gives the line phonic grace. But it's about identity too. Fujino was exploring his identity as a third-generation Japanese-Canadian Sansei in the early 1970s, along with a handful of other advanced-minded Sansei in Toronto and Vancouver, way before the rest of us had even begun to think about issues such as Japanese-Canadian identity. Even now, Fujino's poem evokes the wondering, tenuous relationship Japanese Canadians born in this country have with Japan and their Japanese roots. It's a relationship that one might expect to be fundamental and automatic, and yet it's fraught with the complexity and weight of historical experience to this day. One, some necessary background, dark clouds. In 1942, for reasons that have been proven to be racist and opportunistic, Japanese Canadians were forcibly uprooted from their homes on the west coast of Canada. Over 22,000 people were affected, families were split apart, sent to internment camps, prisoner of war camps, road work sites, and sugar beet farms. They lost their civil liberties, personal property, buildings, land, their institutions, their communities, and ways of life. When the war ended in 1945, Japanese Canadians were given the choice of living east of the Rockies or being sent to Japan. 4,000 chose to go to Japan. In the language of the day, they repatriated. In reality, they were deported. Most had never been to Japan and found themselves in a defeated, war-ravaged country. Japanese Canadians who remained in Canada dispersed widely, with many eventually resettling in Ontario. My parents ended up in Hamilton, where I was born. Post-war, most Japanese Canadians downplayed ethnicity. They did not try to establish a Japantown, as there had been in Vancouver's Powell Street district. When they resettled in eastern cities such as Hamilton and Toronto, they sought homes that were not close to one another as a means of protection against future harms. They did not speak about the 1940s to their children or teach them the Japanese language. They strove to blend in, to demarginalize themselves, or in another framing, to assimilate. Their assimilation was accomplished with frightening speed and success. The intermarriage rate among the Sansei generation, my generation, was calculated to be as high as 95%, and as a visible minority group, Japanese Canadians were near the top of the social mobility ladder. They were, in what has become a sociological catchphrase, a model minority. 2, rays of light. The heroes of Japanese Canadian art for me are a small number of truly remarkable second-generation Nisei who went against the grain and the odds to pursue art making as a way of life. They lived in different parts of the country and for a long time were probably unaware of one another. Born in 1926, Kazuo Nakamura, Roy Kiyoka, and Takeo Tanabe were, to me at least, the triumvirate of senior Japanese Canadian artists. Shizue Takashima was born in 1928 and Nobuo Kubota in 1932. These 5 carved out individualized careers as highly esteemed mainstream Canadian visual artists. Nisei also made prominent marks in other art fields. The novelist, poet Joy Kagawa, who wrote Obasan, architects Raymond Moriyama, whose projects include the Canadian War Museum and the Canadian Embassy in Japan. Eugene Kinoshita, who designed the Bank of Montreal building in Toronto, and landscape architect George Tanaka. They're recognized models of stellar accomplishment. They were few, they were Nisei, and they set the bar really high. Internment themes appeared only occasionally in the collective body of artwork. Kazuo Nakamura had made watercolor paintings at Tashmi internment camp, where he spent his early teen years. Much later, when he was living in Toronto, he produced an extended series of pale green abstract landscapes based on recollections of a lake he often visited to find solace from life in the camp. The painter Shizue Takashima wrote the illustrated children's book about her memories called A Child in a Prison Camp. It's to be expected that as artists, these Nisei would explore traditional Japanese culture and heritage to some degree, even though their lived influences were not primarily Japanese. Kubota and Tanabe, for example, spent what might be considered obligatory brief times in Japan. These Nisei artists did not speak or write the language well, if at all. The cultural connection, however, was significant enough that Japanese references appear periodically amid the modernist influences in their earlier work and throughout the various contemporary currents that flowed through their lifelong art practices. 3, looking for cherry blossoms. In 2004, I assembled an exhibition of artworks by Japanese Canadian artists titled Japanning. at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Hamilton. It was a snappy title. The word was derived from the glossy lacquer from Japan, known as Japan, which is applied to woodcrafts from small boxes to furniture. The implication was that Japaneseness could be brushed on as a protective layer and as visual enhancement of the surfaces. But I was also implying that the integrity of the underlying objects themselves could be glossed over or japanned for the purpose of curatorial expedience. There were few artists making work that had anything to do with anything Japanese, let alone things Japanese Canadian. This pointed to a perplexing prospect for anyone preparing a group exhibition of artworks by Japanese Canadians. Later, in the exhibition catalog for Transformal, which is the title of an exhibition organized by the Latcham Art Gallery in Stouffville, Ontario, in 2012, I wrote, Nobuo Kubota, Louise Noguchi, Naomi Yasu, and Akira Yoshikawa have distinctive art practices shaped by their individual backgrounds in the milieu of contemporary Canadian art. They taught and worked at public art institutions, and they regularly exhibit their works. They do not identify themselves as Japanese Canadian artists. Sporadically, in the work of Kubota, Noguchi, and Yoshikawa, specific references to things Japanese seem to emerge as intuitive impulses. The unanticipated manner in which they appear, or not, suggests the complexity of the role Japaneseness plays, and obliges us to extend our reading and appreciation of each artist's body of work. Nobuo Kubota's calligraphic series, columns of inked, Asian-looking writing on paper, are comprised of characters that are, in fact, invented by him, a device, by the way, that other Japanese Canadian artists, including myself, have used. Around that time, Kubota also created a large sculptural installation titled Hokusai Revisited. It was a huge wood slat construction that filled the gallery, but it was only slimly suggestive of the famous Hokusai wave print that we all know. For Kubota, Japanese associations are evoked intermittently. When employed, the result is a delightful paradox. It references traditional Japanese culture, all right, but it's set in a whimsically ironic form of cultural appropriation. When Louise Noguchi turns her mind to her Japanese roots, she does it with surprising drama and directness. Her video pieces accomplish this most effectively when she physically puts her JC self front and center before the camera, strapped to a revolving wooden wheel, for example, as a cowboy knife thrower flings at the negative spaces around her body. Or in the video Crack in 2000, in which she is wearing a dark kimono with outstretched arms as a bullwhip expert bursts apart the flowers held in her outstretched fingers with a crack. Akira Yoshikawa was born in Japan and immigrated to Canada as a young boy. His mother was an issei and instructor in ikebana, flower arranging. Yoshikawa's spare, contemplative works are influenced by Buddhist philosophy, he says, and in them he combines a disciplined understanding of Japanese aesthetics with an equally alert awareness of contemporary art issues. Born a fourth generation Yonsei, Naomi Yasu is a generation younger than Noguchi and Yoshikawa, and 2 generations removed from Kubota. Her father is a Sansei and her mother of English descent. Yasui's delicately crafted work stems from her research into the early ceramic industry in Europe. She's only asked about her ancestry when people learn her surname. Her work reflects the inevitable blending, alteration, and assimilation of immigrant culture. In the case of Japanese Canadians, this process happened at an accelerated pace. I've got water here written down. 4. Petals. In 1986, I curated shikatakanai. It's a well-used phrase meaning it can't be helped, used particularly to describe Japanese-Canadian reaction to the internment. Can't be helped, shikatakanai. The exhibition was organized by the Artist Front Center, Hamilton Artists, Inc. The show was meant to bring attention to the Japanese-Canadian redress campaign by presenting works and thoughts of 10 very different Japanese-Canadian artists. The exhibition was the first to bring together JC artists from Ontario and the West Coast. It opened in Hamilton, circulated to galleries in Ontario, and ended its travels 2 years later in Burnaby, BC, just after they successfully negotiated redress settlement. So there was quite a celebration out there. I had asked the participating artists a direct question. What does being Japanese Canadian mean to you? Their responses, printed as artist statements in the catalog, revealed the consternation of being artists of Japanese origin at that time. Here are some of them. Louise Noguchi said, "Often when I talk about my work, I'm told that there is a very Oriental or Zen quality to it. Other times, I'm told my work has no reflection of my heritage." Heather Yamada wrote, that is, which parts are Japanesey? Which Canadian? Are they inseparable? Is there division, parsing, categorization, naming? Or is it just the face that wears the name so that when people see the art bearing the name, they say, yeah, I thought there was some kind of Oriental influence. Nobuo Kubota's statement was philosophical. When I was born, I was of the universe. When I was 5, I was the same as everyone else. When I was 8, the war started. I was different. During the war, I was displaced. I was a Jap. In my 20s, I was Japanese Canadian. In my 30s, I was Canadian. At 40, searching for my roots in Japan, I was Japanese. At 55, looking to see who I am, I know that it has nothing to do with being Japanese or Canadian. I was right the first time. I was of the universe. When I asked Takeo Tanabe to take part, he replied, "It's not the most thrilling idea, another ethnic grouping. You give no cogent reason for organizing such an exhibition at this time. Is there any?" he asked me. Still, the answer is yes, I will send a painting. Tanabe's wry reply was acerbic, reflective perhaps of his ambivalence about the notion of Japanese Canadian art. In answer to my "what does being Japanese Canadian mean to you" question, he offered an outrageous but totally intriguing answer. Canada, he said, may be more democratic than the United States. Still, it is not free of negative opinions and prejudice. I quote from an old article as a reminder of the kind of attitude that was pervasive when I was growing up. It's no wonder we were disliked. Tanabe then quotes anthropologist Weston LeBar in an infamous article published in August 1945 after his observation as a community analyst among Japanese Americans in the Topaz internment camp in Utah. Quote, "The Japanese are probably the most compulsive people in the World Ethnological Museum. 19 basic traits of the compulsive personality are these: secretiveness, hiding of emotions and attitudes, perseveration and persistency, conscientiousness, self-righteousness, a tendency to project attitudes, fanaticism, arrogance, touchiness, precision and perfectionism, neatness and ritualistic cleanliness, ceremoniousness, conformity to rule, sadomasochistic behavior, hypochondriasis, suspiciousness, jealousy and enviousness, pedantry, sentimentality, and love of scatological obscenity and anal sexuality." End of quote. There you are, Tanabe said. It describes me perfectly. Very little in these statements from the Shigatagane catalog had anything to do with the work the artists are noted for or presented in the exhibition. But they provided a glimpse. They provided a glimpse into the social and psychological backgrounds from whence the works emerged. The statements reflected sublimated issues of self-identity and rarely expressed perceptions of the artists themselves as Japanese Canadians. Their comments made us reflect on the loss of identity and community, and then symbolically take on the quality of a restorative act. The statements offer personal perspectives on the works for the viewer to ponder. For me, curating exhibitions by Japanese Canadians has been both satisfying for their feeling of communality and problematic in justifying a collective artistic intent. And because I'm interested in Japanese Canadian identity, I've regarded these infrequent group show projects as necessary checkups on the thinking of artists of Japanese descent. 5, redress. In the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, when cultural identity and politics were surging themes in contemporary art, Japanese Canadian artists lagged behind, largely because of the effects of assimilation in 2 generations of suppressed ethnic identity. But in 1988, the Government of Canada redress settlement included funds which were used for community renewal projects. The 1990s saw a wave of artistic projects and an awakening to the possible role of Japanese Canadian identity in one's art practice. Filmmakers, writers, performers, visual artists began the often painful task of reflecting what their parents and grandparents had endured and what had been lost to the succeeding generations of Japanese Canadians. The works they produced were tinged with regret, anger, and a yearning for what might have been. Many of these works are based on personal family history. Montreal filmmaker Michael Fukushima made a short animated film titled Minoru, Memories of Exile, which describes his Canadian born father's difficulties when his family was among those shipped to a devastated Japan at the end of the war. Kerry Sakamoto's The Electrical Field is a novel about how post-war trauma simmers in the lives of a Nisei woman and the Japanese Canadians around her in suburban Toronto. Jay Hirabayashi's Vancouver-based Kokoro dance project, titled Rage, mounted during those years, was a stirring Buto-inspired performance that toured Canada in several versions. 6. Turning Japanese Canadian. In more recent years, similar to the burst of artists' projects after the redress settlement, there has been a burst of activity among Japanese Canadian artists who are personally exploring identity, the legacy of their ancestors in this country, and the historical and cultural threads that tie them together. They include the increasing contributions of Ijusha, or post-war immigrants from Japan. Additionally, well-established visual artists who have firm careers and reputations as artists in the mainstream turn their focus to things Japanese Canadian in their artwork. Artists such as Aiko Suzuki, Lillian Michiko Blakey, Warren Hoyano, Norman Takeuchi, Joanne Maikawa, Barb Miko Gravlin, who all have established practices in Ontario. Sometimes we call them born-again Japanese Canadians. There's a cohort of younger generation artists to whom issues of self and cultural identity seem to be growing as integral parts of their practices, such as Mia Turnbull, Emma Nishimura, Cindy Mochizuki, Laura Shintani, and Hitoko Okada. What's really striking about this new wave of art production is that it's readily discernible as something that may be described as Japanese Canadian art. It's an indication perhaps that one by one, two by two, Japanese Canadians are coming to terms with the truncated development of the history of their people in Canada, and that artists are at the forefront of exploring and expressing the heart of the matter. The Rom Exhibition. In 2018, the Rom, the Royal Ontario Museum, mounted an exhibition of Japanese Canadian themed art by 8 Japanese Canadian artists. For that venerable institution, it was a brave step to embrace the idea of dispersing the artworks among the existing collection of British and French colonial paintings and artifacts in the Rom's Sigmund Solomon Gallery of Canada. One of the several versions of Benjamin West's famous Death of Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham, for example, is featured in that gallery. After reviewing feedback to initial plans for the exhibit from several focus groups, the ROM decided to bring 2 Japanese Canadian guest curators on board, Kathy Yamashita, an artist and arts educator, and me. Although the ROM took a chance it had to take in hiring us, and we introduced significant changes, large and small, we, in good Japanese Canadian fashion, didn't rock the boat too much. The exhibition title was changed from Beauty in a Broken World to Being Japanese Canadian, Reflections on a Broken World. By doing that, we also avoided changing the already produced design logo, which was a shattered circle. Two artists were added. Lillian Michiko Blakey, whose painting of herself as a child in a sugar beet field looking at us from behind strands of barbed wire became the poster image for the show. The other artist, a ceramicist, David Hyoshigi, who lives in Newfoundland, and who had been invited at the outset but was then de-invited after he submitted images of his proposed work. He was re-invited. Hayashida's controversial work consisted of a series of mounted English teacups, the kind he supposed were used for high tea in Victoria at the Empress Hotel. Each cup was painted with hateful propagandist caricatures of Japanese males, the sort, and you may be aware of them, that Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss, produced during World War II. They also featured epithets about yellow chaps that were prevalent in the day. For Hayashida, a sensei, the teacup seemed to be a belated catharsis, a release of suppressed rage. The Rom, to its credit, overcame its discomfort about their inclusion. Apart from Hayashida's new work, the works by the others had been made previously as part of their evolving artistic practices, indicative of the burgeoning interest in expressing personal, family, and community experience and history. The artists, in being Japanese-Canadian, were Sansei and Yonsei. Vivian Wakabayashi from Vancouver, David Hayashida from Newfoundland, Lillian Blakey, Emma Nishimura, and Laura Shintani from Toronto, Margine Matsunaga Turnbull from Onaway, Alberta, Stephen Ninoda from Calgary, and Norman Takeuchi from Ottawa. The exhibition garnered a lot of publicity, and whenever I dropped in, there were Japanese Canadians of all generations whom I met and had conversations with about the experiences of their own families during wartime. Some visitors were really confounded by the way the works were interspersed within the Canadian collection and felt that the works should have been shown altogether in its own space. But I think on the whole, visitors appreciated the point we were trying to make, that Japanese Canadians post-wartime were similarly dispersed and made to blend in. The exhibition, I thought, expressed an appropriately muted parallel history of Canada. But the challenge again was to make sure that the Japanese Canadian works were given a chance to assert themselves and convey their individual messages. And that, as you may understand, is a difficult proposition when so many viewers are more readily drawn to the overall and generalizing social political messages than engaging with discrete works of art. We made several presentations to introduce the exhibition to staff, volunteers, and to the general public. Here's a hastily put together short video that Kathy Yamashita produced for one of them.
Jillian, do you want to hit the lights?
We showed it to give people a glimpse behind the scenes, and there are some comments from the visitor's book, which might be a little hard to read here, but it's an indication of the public response. The music is from a CD by the Yoshida brothers, from the Japanese. I'm at 7 now. Embracing. For a decade or two in the afterglow of redress, there was expressed fear that despite the establishment of Japanese Canadian community centers and the excitement of vindication and victory, Japanese Canadians, without a cause to unite them, would gradually resume its post-war inclination to disappear. The Yonsei generation, after all, is almost totally biracial. Their connections to Japaneseness and Japanese Canadianness, we assumed, fading fast in every way. Recently, the author of the Book of Negroes, Lawrence Hill, who also happens to live in Hamilton, was interviewed in the Hamilton Spectator. He had just published a children's book, and he spoke about the importance of storytelling and story listening. And he spoke about its importance in the transfer of essential cultural energy and emotions. Do Yonsei receive stories in that kind of intimate way? In hearing parents and grandparents finally sharing their experiences around the family dinner table, which happened a lot in Japanese Canadian homes after redress? Or does it really matter how information is conveyed and passed on? What kind of Japanese Canadian art will be produced, and for how long? I expect that Japanese Canadian artists will decide the extent to which our collective history and experience will influence the art they make. There needs to be an openness to what Japanese Canadian art can be. For me, what's most compelling is art that startles, awakens our imaginations, art that confronts, challenges preconceptions by the ways and means that art can. But I dare say that for the Japanese Canadian artist, for every artist, it's a tacit requisite to self-examine. And I'd like to think that for JCs, this will lead them at some point, even for a moment, to the revelation that they are at the center of the community, at the center of our history, and to regard this as an inevitability. And it seems to me today that we can be assured artists will plumb the breadths and depths of our experiences as Japanese Canadians, exploring JC-ness on the wide spectrum of human expression, from sentimentality to irony, from drama to humor, fact to fiction, from ideology to sensation. Roy Kyoka was getting at this, I think, when the Shikataganai show wrapped up in the late 1980s. He wrote, "How to say that all my life I thought I was a real nip loner, prowling the mainstream of can art. Oh, there were others who no doubt felt the same, and all of a sudden there's upteen numbers of us, and all we got in common is our alleged ancestry." The JC community is fortunate to have insightful commentators as Kyoka. Vancouver poet, educator, and historian Roy Miki has written and spoken about the mythologizing of the West Coast experience. And in poet Sally Ito's introduction to the online Japanese Canadian Artists Directory, which was just launched a couple of years ago, she says, "For me, the word that rung true in Kyoka's summation of things was nip loner." She writes, "It was lonely being an artist working in disciplines often without other Japanese Canadians present drawing from the same histories or influences. And although solitude may be what is necessary to create, a community is what is required for the creation to be received and appreciated." 8. Furoshiki, wrapping up. I met up with my Sansei friend Sachiko and her husband Bruce last month when they came down from Ottawa to cheer on their daughter who ran the Around the Bay road race in Hamilton. Over takeout lunch in my gallery, we distanced and reflected on pandemic life. Sachiko, who I've known as a smart, self-possessed person and community leader, made a comment that surprised and stuck with me. She said that pandemic life had undermined her self-confidence. When she said that, it made me reflect on how the isolation, the absence of reinforcement of who we are, which we receive from others, can affect our sense of self-identity, chip away at self-image, make us insecure. Then I think of the Issei and Nisei. Their identities collectively and individually had been near obliterated. My talk has meandered, but we're near the end. It had to do with Japanese-Canadian identity and my efforts to describe and understand how artists have come to terms with what they think and feel they should be doing. And what's ahead? Japan, curiously, is still there for many of us, I think. And it's intriguing to think whether Japan will turn out to be epiphany or reckoning. So here I am, scratching back to where I began with my old friend David Fujino's poem. In its succinct manner, it alludes to the still distant allure of Japan as a kind of destiny that floats us toward or back to the essence of Japanese Canadianness. Japan. Japan. If I say it enough, do you think it'll come true? David never got there, by the way. That's it.